A reading from the Gospel of Luke. When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there's still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full.'" The Gospel of Christ.
So I've been preaching for over 35 years. And in all those years, I have never talked about elections or politicians. I've just kind of let the back and forth flow of electoral life go on without comment from the pulpit. But today, for the first time in all my years of ministry, I will indeed speak directly about politics as I respond to the election of Donald Trump. My words are going to be in 2 parts this morning. First, a forthright assessment about the darkness I believe we are heading into. And then an equally forthright affirmation of who Jesus Christ is in the midst of such times and who we are called to be as his people, the ecclesia, the church. So I'm going to start this morning with a little political history. In the year 1789, the United States Constitution became the supreme law of the United States. The American Constitution is the oldest written and codified national constitution in the world today. It gave the world its first taste of constitutional democracy. This early version was very flawed. For instance, it did not ensure the right to vote for many people, including African Americans, women, indigenous persons, and men who did not own land. It's estimated that only 6% of the US population was eligible to vote under the Constitution as it was composed in 1789. Just 6%. Nonetheless, flawed as it was, the US Constitution back in the day gave principles which over time would be used to open doors to wider voting rights and wider democratic participation. Although, of course, it took many years of hard uphill work by women and men to open more and more doors for those rights and that participation. Nonetheless, the foundation for modern constitutional democracy was laid. But the US Constitution did other things as well. It contained a Bill of Rights, which created what today is called liberal democracy. In this sense, liberal does not mean a liberal party. Liberal in this sense just simply comes from the Latin word liber, for free. And so liberal democracy simply means a democracy which gives rights for individual freedom and gives individual rights to protect against tyranny or abuse by the state. And in the case of the Americans at the time, to restrict the tyranny of the British king and colonial administration and to give representative government. The US Constitution also established a governance system of checks and balances as another way to restrain tyranny and autocratic rule. And the Constitution also significantly advanced the rule of law, whereby legal and judicial processes are not applied arbitrarily to the people. Under the rule of law, people can't just be arrested by some local official arbitrarily because he doesn't like your face or whatever about you. In the rule of law, there has to be regulated public judicial process, including opportunity for appeal. And the US Constitution also made possible the peaceful transfer of power, as opposed to humanity's frequent, through history, violent means of political change. And so all this was the guiding vision of the US Fathers, to provide rights for individual freedom, to provide for the peaceful transfer of power, to provide for the open rule of law, to provide representative government, and most of all, to restrain tyranny and autocratic rule. So the US Constitution, very flawed as it was, nonetheless has been America's great gift to the world. Let's just be clear. No one is claiming liberal constitutional democracy is perfect. There are lots of deep flaws in democracy. And yet, through its principle of open and equitable electoral processes, constitutional democracy remains the best system humanity has found for resisting the powers of tyranny by those with military or political or financial power. Liberal democracy is certainly imperfect, but it's a whole lot better than authoritarianism. Why does all this matter? Why on earth am I talking about the US Constitution and democracy in a Sunday morning sermon here at CMP? After all, neither democracy nor constitution appear in the Bible. They're not even biblical concepts. So why should Christians care about them? Well, the fundamental reason why Christians should care about democracy, despite its imperfections, is precisely because democracy is the most equitable, or let's say the least inequitable, form of political system that humanity has devised so far. In the middle of the last century, facing the rise of both communism and fascism across Europe, major Christian theologians at the time, such as William Temple, Reinhold Niebuhr, and Jacques Maritain, those are names you'd know if you lived in the middle of last century, because they weren't just Christian theologians, they were prominent Christian public intellectuals and figures, gave Christian theological defenses of democracy. And today other Christian theologians are doing likewise for our time. Theologian Luke Bretherton at Duke University says this from his book, Christ and the Common Life, Political Theology and the Case for Democracy. Bretherton says this: Christians do not need democracy to practice their faith. But democracy enshrines some central Christian commitments. And so, as a judgment of practical wisdom, and remember, wisdom is a biblical concept, including in the New Testament. We sometimes kind of overlook that side of Jesus' teaching, his wisdom teaching. As a judgment of practical wisdom, democracy should be an aspirational feature of political order for Christians. Democracy is the political form of neighbor love. That's interesting. Those of you who are Tom Wright fans, don't know if you've seen this recent book he and Michael Bird have released, Jesus and the Powers. Can't quite read the subtitle there, so I put the subtitle on the side there. Christian Political Witness in an Age of Totalitarian Terror and Dysfunctional Democracies. I love that subtitle. Over the past century, Christian thinkers have defended democracy because it is the political structure that provides greatest opportunity, no matter how imperfectly, for important Christian values to be put into wider practice. Values such as freedom of religion, speaking truth to abusive power, and serving and protecting those who are vulnerable in society. Last Tuesday. Let's turn to this past Tuesday, when the majority of adult Americans voted to overturn democracy, to take back from the world the gift that America has given the world. Now, I think most of those who voted for Donald Trump were not thinking of their vote as overturning democracy. They were probably just voting for a better economy, or they're voting against abortion or against left-wing values. All, legitimate reasons in a political system for voting whichever way you want. But knowingly or not, by voting for Donald Trump as president, I believe they voted for the demise of democracy in America. For let us not fool ourselves. Donald Trump and his allies are committed to overturning democracy. Trump is an admirer of dictators like Putin and Xi. We saw the January 6th insurrection at the White House live on TV as it was happening. And we've also seen the deceit by Trump and MAGA loyalists that January 6th was just a quiet, peaceful love-in. Many of us have seen the video clip at which Trump was speaking to a Christian gathering this past July. And in the video, he says that if they vote for him this November, in 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good, you're not going to have to vote again. How else are we supposed to interpret such words and all this and other words that Trump is planning to kill off democracy in America? So for those who think this view of Trump is too pessimistic, I would say read history and read history widely. The patterns we see in Trump and his cohort have been repeated so many times in modern history. Trump and his followers show all the same patterns as other right-wing autocrats and dictators who have risen through modern history, from Italy's Mussolini to Spain's Franco. Of course, there have also been left-wing dictators too, who have been absolutely horrendous, from Stalin to Pol Pot. Left-wing or right-wing, an autocrat is still an autocrat. A dictator is still a dictator. But it's not just democracy that is of concern here. It's also the culture created. We've heard Trump say publicly so many deeply dangerous things. He has said he will seek revenge on his enemies. Last week 2 weeks ago, he talked about Liz Cheney being put in front of a firing squad. His former hand-picked chief of staff, General John Kelly, has publicly stated that on multiple occasions, Kelly heard Trump praising Adolf Hitler, including Trump saying, "I need the kind of generals Hitler had." Trump has said he thinks he should also be able to use the American military against protesting U.S. citizens. Another classic sign of dictatorship. And he wants to remove the broadcast licenses for TV networks that don't cover him the way he wants to be covered. He is on the record for all these and much more that is deeply dangerous. Donald Trump creates a culture of lies, of speaking of his fellow citizens as enemies, speaking hate. This is the culture he has fostered. And some will respond, well, all politicians do this. But I would contend that Trump has elevated all this to an extent far beyond other politicians. His political handlers have taught him to control some of his harmful earlier comments, such as his misogynist statements, such as mocking disabled people. But even if he has learned to control some of his words for political expediency, this is still who he is. So let us be clear. Trump's interest is not in the well-being of others. Trump has zero concern for those who are weak or poor or on the margins. In fact, he despises those who are weak. We heard in this morning's gospel the parable of the great banquet, where the ungrateful, wealthy, and powerful are replaced at God's banquet by those who are weak and excluded and on the margins of society. Donald Trump reverses the parable. He reverses the great banquet by replacing the weak and those on the margins with the wealthy and the powerful. Trump's only real interest is in power and wealth for himself, his family, and his friends. Simple as that. So I believe Americans who voted for Trump have no idea the wreckage he will cause. Just like in the UK, so many Brexiteers, people who voted for Brexit, now regret voting for Brexit. I think likewise we'll see the same effect. We'll see greater and greater disparity between the wealthy and the poor. We'll see magnified environmental damage. We'll see greater division and hatred between people. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I think we're heading into dark times for the long term. Let's also be clear that the values and culture created by Trump and his allies will make their way to Canada, including resurrecting the old American idea of manifest destiny that America should own all of North America. So here's the key question. How do we respond as followers of Jesus? First, let me say that through 2,000 years of history, living under the equivalent of dictatorship and arbitrary rule has been the usual experience for Christians. Those of us who've had the privilege of living our whole lives under liberal constitutional democracies are often unaware that our experience has not been the experience of most Christians through history. Let me take us back to St. Augustine, the greatest thinker in Christianity's first 1,000 years. In the late 300s, early 400s, Augustine was bishop of the city of Hippo in present-day Algeria. He wrote 4 famous and deeply influential books, one of which is called The City of God. Now, he wrote The City of God shortly after the Visigoths. So the Visigoths were a northern European peoples. And the Visigoths sacked Rome. So, for many centuries, Rome had been the center of the mighty Roman Empire. It had been a city of stability and prosperity and security. But the Roman Empire was now falling apart. And now the unthinkable was happening. After centuries of safety and stability, these invaders from Northern Europe defeated the supposedly invincible Roman military. They arrived at Rome and entered and sacked the city. This left Romans, including Christians, in deep shock. The unthinkable had happened. Stability, security, and prosperity were gone. Augustine wrote The City of God to offer a Christian way to understand this unthinkably shocking event. And here is part of what he wrote, reminding Roman Christians of God's picture, that despite the unthinkable happening, Jesus is Lord of history. So here's one thing he said in there. The church holds that it is in her Lord that is to be found the key, the focal point, the goal of humanity, the goal of human history. So by pointing to Augustine, I want to remind us that there have been countless times in history around the world when our ancestors in the faith, our fellow followers of Jesus, have had to come to terms with shocking and fearful political developments in their time and place. There's no reason we should be any different. But most of all, important of all, is, of course, Jesus himself. For the Jesus movement emerged in the midst of Roman dictatorship and oppression. See, God became incarnate in Jesus not when Israel was independent and free, but rather when the Jews were an oppressed, exploited colony under the dictatorship of Rome. Here's what's so interesting. If Jesus had been born 60 years earlier, he would have been born during Israelite independence and freedom. So why instead would God become incarnate just 60 years later? The God of billions of years. You know, he could have moved it 60 years earlier. Why not? I believe because God's timing was intentional. For God chose to be born as weak as possible to poor villagers in an obscure region under colonial oppression. Because part of what God wanted to do through this sort of birth was to speak to two audiences. One audience was those with power of any sort. To say, here is how, follow my son. This is how to exercise power. And the other audience for God's timing in this sort of birth was for those without power, those who had to live within systems of abusive power. This is precisely why in a minute we are going to say together the Philippians Creed. And when we say that, I want each of us to pay intense attention to each word. When we say those words, to pay close attention. So, Christianity was born within autocracy and dictatorship. And so we need only look to Scripture to see what sort of movement Jesus created within such conditions. We could even say Christianity is a faith for living within autocracy and dictatorship. And how is that? Through resistance. Jesus started a resistance movement. But unlike the many other Jewish resistance movements under Roman occupation, and there were many, unlike those, Jesus' resistance movement was a non-violent movement of resisting evil by love and by hope, including for enemies, but especially for those most vulnerable under such conditions. So I want us to join together right now in an act of trust and hope in God by saying these well-known words together. And I invite you to join together in saying this. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Goodness and love, thank you, follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. So, this is how we respond to the election of Donald Trump. We continue to affirm that Jesus is Lord of all history. We continue to learn from history. We continue to build worshiping community that seeks to follow the way of Jesus together, to wrestle together, to figure out how to practice that way, the Jesus way, in our own time and place. We continue reaching out in love and hope to serve others, especially those who are vulnerable and on the margins. And we continue to speak truth to abusive power. We don't retreat into ourselves, but we continue to build common life with others in society. And as we see in John's vision in Revelation, we continue to trust in God's ultimate redemption at the end of the ages. And one of the many practical ways in which we continue to serve others in love and hope is to actively defend democracy, imperfect as it is. I have lots more I could say, but that's plenty for one morning. So I now invite you to please stand, and we will affirm our faith in the words of the Philippians Creed. Jesus, though being in very nature